The morning sun spilled softly through the tall glass windows of the corporate tower, reflecting off shiny floors as employees rushed through the lobby. The office buzzed with quiet urgency, the sound of clicking keyboards, hurried footsteps, and the low hum of coffee machines. Among the crowd was Aaron, a calm and hard-working employee who greeted everyone with a polite smile. He wasn't the loudest or the most confident person in the room, but his steady focus and kindness made him well respected among his peers. He always arrived early, double-checked his reports, and helped others without expecting praise. The atmosphere changed sharply when Mr. Collins, the branch manager, arrived. He stormed through the hallway, his leather shoes striking the floor like warning shots. Everyone's conversations faded instantly, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. Collins had a reputation, sharp-tongued, quick to anger, and overly proud of his title. He believed authority meant fear, not respect. Today, he looked especially irritated, his tie slightly loose, his brow furrowed as if the world had personally offended him. Without greeting anyone, he threw his briefcase onto his desk and barked orders at the nearest assistant. Aaron kept his eyes on his computer, silently hoping to avoid attention. The morning dragged on as tension spread through the office like a quiet storm. Collins scolded one employee for a missing file, another for a late email, and muttered complaints about everyone's incompetence. Yet, when it came to Aaron's work, there were never real mistakes, just excuses for Collins to assert dominance. Despite the harsh tone and heavy atmosphere, Aaron stayed calm, quietly adjusting numbers, proofreading documents, and doing his best to keep things running smoothly. He never raised his voice, even when he was wrongly blamed. To him, patience was strength. By noon, the office was silent except for the ticking clock and the occasional sigh. Everyone knew a storm was coming. Collins' bad mood never passed quietly. He would find someone to unleash it on before the day ended. What no one knew was that today would be different. Today, his arrogance would go too far. As Aaron gathered papers for the afternoon meeting, he could feel Collins' eyes on him, studying, waiting. The tension was almost visible, a rope stretched too tight, ready to snap. In that moment, the peaceful worker and the prideful manager stood at opposite ends of a story that would soon shake the entire company. And while Aaron didn't yet know it, the universe had already started writing, the moment when arrogance would meet its quiet reckoning. The conference room was filled with the usual sound of shuffling, papers and murmurs as the team gathered around the long glass table. The air conditioner hummed quietly above them, but beneath the calm surface, tension was heavy. Mr. Collins stood at the front, his expensive suit crisp, his expression sharp with impatience. Aaron sat near the projector, nervously scrolling through slides, double-checking every line of data before the presentation began. He had stayed late the previous night, ensuring every detail was perfect, or so he thought. When the meeting started, Collins' voice dominated the room. He spoke about quarterly goals, profits, and deadlines, pacing like a general addressing his soldiers. Everything was smooth until one slide flickered onto the screen, a small numerical error, barely noticeable to anyone else. But Collins saw it immediately. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and the room's energy shifted in an instant. "Who prepared this?" he snapped, his tone cold enough to silence the whispers. Aaron hesitated, then quietly said, "I did, sir. I must have missed." Before he could finish, Collins slammed his hand on the table. "Missed," he repeated mockingly. "Do you realize how unprofessional this looks in front of our board?" The other employees lowered their heads, afraid to move, or even breathe. Aaron's face turned pale, but he kept his composure. "I'll correct it right now," he said softly. But Collins wasn't interested in correction. He wanted control. He stepped closer, towering over Aaron, his words cutting through the room like glass. "Maybe you need to learn what real accountability means." And before anyone could react, he struck Aaron across the face, not hard enough to injure, but enough to humiliate. The sound echoed. Papers stopped rustling. No one spoke. The slap wasn't just physical. It was the collapse of every ounce of respect the employees had left for their manager. Aaron didn't move. His hand didn't rise to his cheek. His eyes stayed steady, even though his heart was racing. The silence in the room was suffocating. Some employees looked away, others looked down, pretending not to see. Colin straightened his tie, as if the act had somehow restored his authority. "Fix it," he said coldly, and turned his back, returning to his chair as though nothing had happened. Aaron nodded once, quietly, and resumed his work without another word. But behind that silence was something deeper, a storm waiting to rise. As the meeting continued, the atmosphere felt strange, almost electric. No one dared to speak, but everyone knew what they had just witnessed would not be forgotten. And though Collins believed he had reminded them who held power in the room, he was wrong. That single moment of arrogance had set something in motion, something that would soon return to him with the quiet, unstoppable force of karma. The moment the meeting ended, Aaron gathered his scattered papers with slow, deliberate movements. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression remained calm, almost too calm. The room stayed silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. No one dared to make eye contact. The faint sound of his pen clicking into place felt louder than anything else. Without saying a word, he placed his files neatly into his worn leather bag, slung it over his shoulder, and began to walk toward the door. His footsteps echoed in the heavy silence, each step carrying quiet dignity that words could never express. A few coworkers shifted in their seats, guilt flickering across their faces. They wanted to speak, to apologize, to show some kind of support, but fear kept them frozen. Mr. Collins didn't look up. He was pretending to go through his notes, though his hand slightly twitched. Deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. As Aaron reached the door, someone whispered his name, but he didn't turn around. He simply paused for a second, as if taking one last breath of that suffocating office air, then walked out. The glass door clicked shut behind him, and for a long moment, no one moved. That sound, the door closing, felt like a judgment passed on everyone in the room. The rest of the day dragged on, but nothing felt the same. The once lively chatter of keyboards and phones was replaced by an uneasy quiet. No jokes, no laughter, just the low hum of machines and the weight of what had happened. People avoided looking at Collins when he passed. The same employees who once scrambled to please him now lowered their eyes, pretending to be busy. Respect, the kind that holds a team together, had quietly died that morning. Collins, however, didn't seem to notice at first. He carried on barking orders, trying to maintain control, but his words no longer carried the same power. He could feel it, the shift in the room, the cold politeness, the lack of warmth in every "yes, sir." For the first time in years, he felt like the outsider among his own team. Meanwhile, Aaron walked through the lobby without glancing back. The receptionist gave him a small, sympathetic nod, but he didn't stop. Outside, the city noise greeted him, cars honking, people rushing, a reminder that the world moved on, even after moments that broke something inside you. He inhaled deeply, letting the cool air steady his heart. There was no anger in his eyes, just quiet determination. He wasn't defeated, only finished with a place that had forgotten basic humanity. Back inside, Collins stood by the window, watching the streets below. His reflection looked different, smaller somehow. The power he once wore like armor now felt heavy, hollow. He told himself he had done the right thing, that discipline was necessary. But a small, unsettling thought whispered in the back of his mind. What if he had just made the worst mistake of his career? Little did he know, the silence that settled in his office that day was not the end. It was the beginning of karma preparing to speak. By the afternoon, the office had transformed into a storm of whispers. Every cubicle hummed with quiet conversations. Every corridor seemed to carry fragments of the same story: the slap, the silence, and Aaron's calm departure. No one dared to speak loudly, but everyone knew what had happened. The story spread like wildfire, passing from one department to another, picking up tiny details with each retelling. Some said Collins had lost control, others claimed it wasn't the first time. But one thing was certain: respect for him was gone. Employees who once smiled politely when he passed now exchanged wary glances. The sound of his approaching footsteps made conversation stop mid-sentence. Yet, behind the stillness, phones recorded and messages flew through group chats. Screens lit up with quiet revenge, small clips, subtle evidence of his arrogance and temper. People were no longer afraid to document the truth. Collins, on the other hand, walked through the floor with his usual swagger, pretending not to notice the sudden hush that followed him. He believed fear still meant control. He adjusted his tie, straightened his suit, and said loudly to his assistant, "Let them whisper. I run this place." His voice carried the same pride that had kept him blind for years. But this time, it didn't echo. It just lingered in the tense air, sounding hollow and desperate. The assistant nodded quickly, though her eyes didn't meet his. Deep inside, even she knew his reign was cracking. As the hours passed, the atmosphere grew heavier. Workers moved more carefully, their eyes darting toward the security cameras in Collins' glass office. A few brave ones even began to record his harsh remarks during meetings, the moments when he belittled or shouted. Each file was quietly saved, a digital collection of the arrogance that had once gone unchecked. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. But Collins remained unaware. He mistook silence for submission. When he entered the break room, laughter stopped. When he left, it started again. The walls themselves seemed to hold secrets now. He could feel eyes on him, but convinced himself they were watching out of respect. In truth, they were watching for his fall. That evening, as he reviewed reports in his office, Collins caught sight of his reflection in the glass wall. A man in a fine suit. But behind him, empty desks, turned backs, and a silence too deep for comfort. The realization crept in slowly. Maybe authority without humanity wasn't power after all. Outside, whispers continued like a quiet rebellion, growing stronger each minute. And while he still believed he was untouchable, the storm that would soon shatter his pride had already begun forming in those hushed voices and hidden recordings. The empire he thought he ruled was quietly turning against him, one whispered word at a time. The next morning began with an unusual tension in the air. The office, usually filled with the clicking of keyboards and phone chatter, felt quieter than usual. Even the coffee machine seemed to hiss softer. Collins arrived a few minutes late, still adjusting his tie, unaware of the storm waiting for him. As he stepped into his office, his phone rang, a call from the company's headquarters. His brows lifted. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Mr. Collins, the CEO will be visiting your branch today. Please make sure you're available." For a brief second, his nerves tightened, but pride quickly pushed it away. He smirked and leaned back in his chair, convincing himself it had to be about a promotion. After all, the branch's numbers were strong, and he'd spent years building his reputation as a tough manager. Maybe, he thought, they finally recognized his authority. But outside his glass walls, the employees knew the truth. They had seen the email from HR sent late the previous night, short, official, and unmistakably serious. Someone from corporate had requested all internal surveillance footage from the past week. The whispers that had filled the office yesterday were now replaced by anxious silence. People avoided eye contact, unsure of what was about to happen but certain it wasn't good for Collins. He spent the morning straightening his desk, reviewing reports he wouldn't need, and rehearsing polite phrases he planned to say to the CEO. "It's an honor to have you visit, sir," he mumbled to himself, forcing a smile in the reflection of his glass window. Yet, somewhere deep inside, A small unease began to grow, a feeling he couldn't quite ignore. He brushed it off and barked orders at his assistant to prepare coffee and arrange the conference room to look more professional. Hours passed until the sound of an arriving black car silenced the office completely. The CEO, a.com/older man with a reputation for fairness, stepped through the doors. His presence carried quiet authority, the kind that didn't need raised voices. Collins rushed forward with a forced grin, extending his hand, but the CEO didn't take it. Instead, he said softly, "Let's talk in your office." The words felt heavy. As the door closed behind them, the CEO placed a tablet on the desk and pressed play. On the screen was the security footage, the meeting, the slap, the silence that followed. Collins' confident smile faded instantly. Every second of the clip felt like a punch to his pride. The CEO didn't yell, didn't scold. He simply said, "You've built fear here, not respect. That ends today." Outside, employees exchanged quiet glances as the muffled conversation continued. Some felt justice approaching, others simply waited in stunned silence. Collins' arrogance had carried him for years, but now, sitting across from the man who had seen everything, he finally understood. The higher he thought he'd climbed, the harder he was about to fall. By noon, the entire office had fallen into an uneasy silence. Everyone had heard about the CEO's arrival, but no one expected what happened next. Through the tall glass windows, employees saw a sleek black luxury car roll to a stop at the entrance. The tinted door opened slowly, and out stepped the CEO, his calm yet commanding presence immediately filling the atmosphere with tension. But it wasn't just him. As another door opened, a man followed behind, and the moment people recognized his face, quiet gasps rippled through the crowd. It was Aaron, the same quiet, humble employee who had walked out just a day ago, now stood beside the CEO, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Collins, watching from his office window, froze for a second. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by disbelief. What was Aaron doing here? Why was he with the CEO? His thoughts raced, but no answer made sense. The elevator doors opened, and the two men walked in together. Employees tried to look busy, but their eyes followed every step. The CEO didn't speak a word, but everyone could feel the weight of his silence. When the elevator reached the top floor, Collins adjusted his tie nervously, forcing a smile as the door slid open. "Sir, it's such an honor to," he began, but his voice cracked as his eyes shifted to Aaron standing right beside the CEO. The air grew thick, heavy enough to make even breathing feel difficult. The CEO's eyes met Collins', cold and steady. "Let's gather everyone in the conference room," he said in a tone that allowed no argument. Within minutes, the entire staff was assembled. No one dared to whisper. Collins stood at the front, trying to maintain his composure, but his palms were sweating. Aaron stood silently near the CEO, hands clasped in front of him, his calmness contrasting sharply with Collins' nervous energy. The CEO began to speak, his voice slow and deliberate. "I came here today because of an incident that happened in this office yesterday. Something I never expected from one of my senior managers." He turned to look at Collins, whose forced smile had completely vanished. The CEO continued, "A workplace should be built on respect, not fear. But it seems some people here have forgotten that." Then, turning slightly, he gestured toward Aaron. "This young man you humiliated yesterday is not just an employee. He is someone I personally admire. Not because of his title, but because of his character." Collins' heart pounded in his chest. The room seemed to close in around him as the CEO's next words landed like thunder. "Aaron is my son." Gasps filled the room. Collins felt his legs weaken. He stared at Aaron, who looked back with quiet dignity, not anger. The truth had unfolded before everyone. The man Collins had treated like nothing was, in fact, the son of the company's highest authority. Every ounce of Colin's arrogance drained from his face as he realized the depth of his mistake. The man who once believed he ran the office now stood exposed, powerless, and small. The room was so silent that even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt loud. Every eye was fixed on the CEO as he stood tall, his expression unreadable. Colin stood a few steps away, his confidence shattered, his throat dry as sand. The CEO slowly turned toward him and spoke in a voice that cut through the heavy air like a blade. "You remember this man?" he asked, gesturing toward Aaron, who stood quietly beside him. Collins could barely nod. His lips trembled, and his voice caught in his throat. "Why, yes, sir. He works here," he muttered, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. The CEO's eyes hardened. "You slapped the son of the company's founder," he said coldly. Those words echoed through the room like thunder. A collective gasp swept across the office as employees exchanged shocked looks. Some covered their mouths. Others couldn't look away. Colin's face turned pale. For a second, he couldn't process the words. The founder's son. His mind raced back to the moment in the conference room. His own arrogant voice, his raised hand, the sound of that slap. His stomach twisted in regret. He had thought Aaron was just another junior worker, someone too timid to fight back. Now he realized he had humiliated the one person he should have treated with the greatest respect. The CEO didn't need to raise his voice. His disappointment spoke louder than anger ever could. "You built your authority on fear, not leadership," he said. "You thought success gave you power, but you forgot that respect is earned, not demanded." Aaron stayed quiet through it all. His calmness wasn't pride, it was strength. The same man who had been insulted in front of everyone now stood as a symbol of dignity and patience. The staff watched him with a mix of awe and guilt, realizing how they too had stayed silent when he needed them the most. Collins tried to speak, to explain himself, but his words failed him. "Sir, I didn't know," he stammered. The CEO cut him off sharply. "That's the problem, Collins. You never cared to know. You never saw the people working under you as humans, only as tools for your ego." Every word struck Collins like a blow. He could feel the respect of his team slipping away completely. The same people who once feared him now pitied him. His world, built on arrogance and control, was collapsing in front of everyone. The CEO's gaze softened slightly as he turned toward Aaron. "Sometimes," he said, "we test character not by giving power, but by taking it away. You showed humility when you could have demanded revenge. That's what true strength looks like." The employees nodded quietly, their faces reflecting a deep sense of realization. Collins lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. In that single moment, he understood the weight of his actions. The humiliation he had caused, the respect he had lost, and the irreversible damage done by his pride. The man who once believed he ruled the office now stood exposed, surrounded by the very people who had seen his downfall unfold. The silence in the office was heavier than ever. Colin stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly as the CEO's cold gaze remained fixed on him. He opened his mouth to speak, desperate to explain, to defend himself, to say something that could erase the damage. "Sir, please, I didn't mean," he started, but his voice cracked midway, and his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The CEO raised a hand, cutting him off before he could continue. "Enough," he said firmly. "You had your chance to mean something. Now you can mean nothing." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a white envelope, its edges sharp and final. As he handed it over, Colin's heart sank. His fingers hesitated before touching it, already knowing what it was. "This," the CEO said slowly, "is your termination letter, effective immediately." The room seemed to shrink around Collins as those words settled in. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the letter, as if refusing to believe it was real. The paper felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He glanced around the room, looking for a sympathetic face, but all he saw were the quiet, distant eyes of people who once feared him and now pitied him. He swallowed hard, forcing a weak smile, as if pretending it didn't hurt, but his voice betrayed him. I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words had no life left in them. They fell into the air and disappeared like smoke. No one replied. The employees who once jumped at his every command now stood silent, watching as arrogance met its end. The CEO turned away, signaling that the discussion was over. Collins was no longer part of this place, no longer the man behind the polished desk, no longer the one giving orders. With slow, shaky hands, he began clearing his belongings. A few papers, his nameplate, a photo of himself standing proudly in the office he had now lost. Each item felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. The walk to the door felt endless. Every step echoed in the quiet hall like a slow drumbeat, marking the death of his pride. As he passed his employees, he noticed their faces not cruel, not mocking, but filled with something far worse, disappointment. He remembered the way they used to bow their heads when he walked by, the way his voice used to fill the air with authority. Now, the same people looked at him with calm indifference. It wasn't hate that hurt him, it was knowing he no longer mattered. One woman, the receptionist who had once feared his temper, looked up briefly and then looked away, as if he were already gone. When Collins reached the exit, he turned one last time to glance at the office that had once been his kingdom. For the first time, he realized what he had truly lost. It wasn't the position, the salary, or the power. It was the respect that made all of it worth having. And as he pushed open the glass door and stepped outside, the reflection staring back at him wasn't that of a manager, but of a man finally brought down by his own pride. As Collins stood near the door, clutching the envelope that ended his career, the CEO's voice was about to order security to escort him out. The tension in the room was sharp enough to cut through silence. Everyone expected humiliation, a harsh final word, maybe even anger from Aaron after all that had happened. But then, unexpectedly, Aaron took a quiet step forward. His voice, calm yet filled with strength, broke the heavy air. "Let him go peacefully," he said softly, his tone carrying more weight than any punishment could. The room froze again, not in fear this time, but in disbelief. Aaron, the man who had been humiliated in front of everyone, wasn't seeking revenge. He was choosing grace. The CEO turned his head slightly, surprised by the young man's request. Collins looked up too, confusion flickering in his eyes. He expected anger, perhaps satisfaction from Aaron, but instead found calmness and dignity, something he himself had never shown. Aaron continued, his words steady. "He's learned his lesson. Let's not destroy what's already broken." Those words carried a quiet power that made even the CEO pause. For a few moments, no one spoke. The entire office seemed to breathe again, but slower, softer. The employees looked at Aaron with a new kind of respect, one that went beyond titles and power. He wasn't acting like the son of the company's founder. He was acting like a true leader. His decision reflected something deeper. He understood that revenge doesn't heal wounds, it only deepens them. The CEO finally nodded and stepped back, allowing Collins to leave without further humiliation. The decision stunned everyone, but it also filled the room with a quiet sense of awe. Forgiveness had replaced fury, and for the first time in days, peace settled like a gentle wind. Collins stood still, unable to move for a moment. His eyes, filled with regret, met Aaron's. There was no hate there, no anger, just calm understanding. That expression struck harder than any words could. Slowly, Collins lowered his head, a gesture of respect he had never given to anyone before. He turned and walked out of the office, each step lighter, though his heart carried the weight of his own actions. As the door closed behind him, the employees remained silent, still processing what had just happened. They had expected drama, maybe revenge, but instead, they had witnessed something far more powerful, compassion in its purest form. After Collins left, the CEO turned to Aaron, studying him with quiet admiration. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. Aaron didn't respond with pride. He simply nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Around him, his coworkers whispered, not about Collins' downfall, but about Aaron's grace. In that single moment, everyone in that office learned a lesson no rulebook or training could ever teach, that true strength lies not in how you rise above others, but in how you treat those who fall. And while Collins had lost everything that day, Aaron gained something far greater, the respect and admiration of everyone around him, earned not through power, but through kindness. Weeks passed since that unforgettable day, but the memory of what had happened in the office still lingered in every corner. The employees often found themselves speaking in hushed tones about the moment when grace triumphed over arrogance. The story of how Aaron forgave the very man who had humiliated him spread quietly but powerfully. Becoming more than just office gossip, it became a lesson. Soon after, the company officially announced that Aaron had been promoted to branch manager. The news didn't surprise anyone. In fact, it felt right. The same man who once sat silently at his desk, enduring disrespect with patience, now led the very office that had witnessed both cruelty and compassion in their purest forms. When Aaron walked into his new office for the first time, there was no pride in his eyes, only calm determination. Under his leadership, the atmosphere began to change. The employees noticed it first in the small things. He greeted everyone with a smile each morning, asked about their well-being, and listened when someone had a concern. There were no more raised voices, no more fear-driven days. People started coming to work with motivation instead of anxiety. Productivity rose, not because of strict rules or threats, but because everyone respected the man guiding them. They wanted to do their best, not to impress him, but because they genuinely cared about the environment he created. Aaron believed that kindness didn't mean weakness. It meant strength under control. He handled problems with fairness, treated mistakes as chances to learn, and gave second chances where others might have given punishment. Slowly, his branch became known as one of the happiest and most successful in the company. Meanwhile, Collins' story traveled across departments, whispered as both a warning and a reminder. New employees heard about the former manager who lost everything because of his arrogance, and how the man he insulted rose to lead with grace. The incident became more than just a scandal. It turned into a moral tale that shaped the company's culture. Some said karma had spoken that day, but others believed it was simply life's way of balancing things out. Aaron never spoke badly of Collins. In fact, whenever someone brought up that incident, he would just smile and say, "Karma doesn't need anger, it just needs time." Those words stayed with everyone who heard them, simple yet deeply meaningful. As time passed, the company grew stronger, not just in numbers, but in heart. The legacy Aaron left behind wasn't written in reports or profits, it was written in how people treated one another. Years later, employees still shared his story with newcomers, describing the day when kindness won over cruelty and forgiveness proved more powerful than revenge. The office that once echoed with tension now carried an air of warmth and unity. And in that quiet harmony, Aaron's philosophy lived, Anna, reminder that humility rebuilds what arrogance destroys, and that true leadership begins not with power, but with compassion.